Hello and welcome to the FCC Next Steps podcast. My name is Jordan. I'm the lead pastor here at First Christian Church in Monmouth. And this podcast is an opportunity for myself and the other staff members to start just bringing some discipleship content to you all that doesn't necessarily sit into a nice, neat Sunday morning format. For example, right now we are in a study just looking at the first chapter of the book of Genesis, the creation story. And we've been going through just sort of an academic analysis of this book. In the previous sessions, we've looked at the historical setting and sort of the background of the book. In the past two sessions, we've looked at sort of the genre and some of the literature of the ancient Near East and how Genesis chapter 1 fits into that really nicely. We also looked at verse 1 in the previous session and saw that it's likely describing a very different kind of view on the world than what we might typically expect. And we're going to see that again today as we get into verse 2. So a couple of goals for today. We're going to first look at the structure of the story. In verse 2, we're going to see that Genesis chapter 1 is a very organized story. And even though it is ancient and even though it is, we might assume that it because it's a narrative, it's more narratively structured, but it's a very intentional organization of this book and of how this story is told. So we're going to see that. We're also going to address two things that show up in the second verse, this picture of the deep and the idea of God's spirit, and talk about what exactly is that. So let's just go ahead and get into the passage. You look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. It says, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Now, when we read this, again, we might have a certain image in our mind, and we might imagine like a globe and something to do with that. But really, what's pictured here is, it's hard to describe. It's a picture of chaos. It's not that there's nothing, because we read here there's something called the surface of the deep. So something exists, but we read that it's formless and it's empty. And so sometimes we get this doctrine is called creation ex nihilo. It's Latin for creation out of nothing. And that's, if we want to talk about how the universe physically came to existence, yes, God had to originate things. But when we look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, it's not nothing that's depicted here. It's chaos. It's a mess. It's unstructured. It's empty. There's no life. There's no significance, but there is something here. And so the story of Genesis chapter 1 is God taking the chaotic emptiness and then fighting that and wrangling it into something that is good. And that's captured in two words that are really prominent here. They're underlined if you're looking at the screen. The word is formless and empty. In the Hebrew, is the words tohu and bohu. And so it actually reads tohu vabohu. And so you can hear that it's got a little bit of a rhyme and cadence to it, because originally this was an auditory story that people would have heard, and that makes it a little more memorable if things kind of rhyme. And we actually see this in different spots really throughout all the Old Testament. There's a lot of wordplay, rhyme, things like that we just kind of miss because it's lost in translation. But these two words, they provide, they don't just introduce the problem of the story, they introduce the structure as well. If you're able to look at the screen and watch this in video format, you can see a nice little chart on the screen. If you're only listening, I'll do my best to describe it. But we have here the two words, formless and empty, or tohu and bohu. And there are 6 creation days that fit nicely into each of those categories. So if we're talking about the problem of formlessness, we read the first 3 days are really God's way of addressing that. And he takes this chaotic nothingness and he gives it form. For example, in day 1, we see the origin of day and night. In day 2, we see the origin of the waters and the sky, kind of. We'll get into that next session a little bit, but we see the structure there. In day 3, we see the origin of the dry land and the plants that cover the land. And so there's nothing in these things. I don't want you to imagine that this, the day and night is like the sun, moon, and stars. That hasn't happened yet. It's just the existence of day and night. It's still empty, but those structures are there. The origin of the waters and of the sky, there's nothing in them, but there's structures there. The plants and the land, they didn't consider plants necessarily like creatures or living things, but there's a structure where previously there's just this chaotic deep, and we'll talk about what the deep is here in just a second. But you can see here there's a problem of formlessness, and by the end of day 3, now there is form. There's a stage on which this drama can unfold. If we look at the second the second set of creation days 4 through 6, you can see that they address the problem of emptiness, and they also correlate with their corresponding respective formed days. For example, day 4, we read about the origin of the sun, moon, and stars, and they fill the sky the day and the night that originated or were formed on day 1. We get to day 5, we see the origin of birds and marine life, and they fill the waters and sky that were formed on day 2. Day 6, the origin of creepy crawlies and land animals and humanity that fills the dry land that was formed on day 3. And so there's structure here, a very intentional and thought out structure. And it's interesting that not only does this structure address the problems of the story, but even organizing the story in such a way sort of further emphasizes and supports the message of the story, that where there was chaos, God took it and made it good. He made it purposeful and functional and organized. And even the way the story is told helps to teach and reinforce that lesson. So you can see that this is, while an ancient story, a highly structured story, and we should probably see in that too some evidence of, again, literary characteristics and the literary nature of this. Every good story is structured intentionally, and we see that in Genesis chapter 1 as well. And so there is a logical flow and development to the events of this. Now, the surface of the deep, we read that the world was formless and empty, and the deep is this thing that just sort of exists amongst the chaos and the emptiness and the formlessness. The deep is actually a very common image in ancient literature, and not just in the ancient Near East, but really in the ancient world in general. And it really harkens back to just a kind of a fear or an apprehension regarding the ocean itself and just how chaotic it could be, how dangerous it could be. And so the deep becomes this primordial sea that is emblematic of chaos. It is a challenge or a rival to the gods. In fact, the gods in some cultures we're going to see are the gods because they overcome the deep. And it is emblematic of fear, and it conjures up these images of dread at times. And we can see these in different cultures. For instance, in Greek mythology, Oceanus is this figure. He's one of the Titans. And if you know anything about Greek mythology, the Titans were these beings who rivaled the gods and even challenged the gods at one point. Now, interestingly, in Greek mythology, in some of the stories, Oceanus is the one Titan that didn't rebel and challenge against the gods, but he's still depicted as this being who is on par with the gods. And so the deep, symbolized by Oceanus, is still sort of a counterpoint or a non-hostile rival to the gods. He's the guard dog whose cage you don't want to rattle. And so it's a challenge waiting to happen. We could get to the Akkadian culture, Babylonian mythology. And we saw this in a previous session when we looked at ancient Near Eastern literature. The Akkadians had this story about their gods and their chief god Marduk and how he came to be the chief god. And it all revolves around this story of this being called Tiamat. And Tiamat was, she's depicted as this sea serpent, dragon, monster creature who is sort of representative of the deep in general. The deep is where she dwells and lives. That's her domain, and it is chaos, and it is the counterpoints to organized existence and life. And so Tiamat actually rivals the gods. She challenges them, and the gods are afraid of her. And Marduk is selected from among them to go and to be their champion. And because he's the one that conquers Tiamat and the deep and the chaos that she represents and brings order to the world, he now becomes the chief god. So you can see in these stories and in ancient stories like these that we didn't have time to talk about, the deep is a legitimate fear and a legitimate a villain of sorts, an antagonist to the divine, and it is sort of the counterpoint of life and existence and the world as we know it. That's not really the picture we get in Genesis chapter 1. The deep is there. It's still this primordial ocean, but when we look at the picture here, it's not this raging rival to Yahweh. In fact, Yahweh's presence, his spirit, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute, it hovers above the deep, almost in anticipation of God speaking and enacting his creative will. God's not threatened by the deep. He doesn't have to conquer the deep. He doesn't have to defeat some sort of being or ancient creature. In fact, we're going to read in one of the filling days, when God creates marine life, it says he creates the great creatures of the deep. That word that's used there is in reference to sea monsters. The Tananim, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but these great beings that other cultures looked at and feared and saw as rivals to the God are just another part of God's created world that serves and glorifies him. It's a very different depiction of the deep than what we have in other cultures and other literature. And that really hits on something I had said in a previous session. Genesis chapter 1 is an ancient Near Eastern myth, and it uses all of the symbols and the images and the terminology and the motifs of the ancient myths of its region and day, but it takes all of those and uses them in a very different kind of way. And so it's not fair to look at Genesis and say that it's just a copy of these ancient stories. It's very deliberate in taking these ancient stories and familiar idolatrous elements and then turning them on their head in such a way that they tell the truth about who Yahweh, the one true God, really is. It's really beautiful and really clever, and it's a very sophisticated story in how it's composed and how it uses these different elements. And so when we read these, and I refer to ancient Near Eastern literature and myths and all these things, that should not put us off on this story or cause us to look at it as less reliable in some way. It's telling very true things using ancient stories. And in some ways, it's a myth that demythologizes the world for ancient people. For example, if I were Babylonian and I looked at the ocean, my first thought would be this is some chaotic force from which beings challenging the gods once dwelled. It's something to be afraid of. But if I'm a Hebrew who knows the story of Genesis chapter 1, I look at that same ocean and I don't see an idolatrous God that needs to be feared and appeased. I just see water that my God made and is sovereign over. And it creates a world that's far less frightening, far more understandable, and far more beneficial to people living in this world. And that's a theme that will show up a little later when we get into some of the creation days. So let's move on in the text, and let's talk about God's Spirit. We read that there's the deep and that God's Spirit hovered over the deep. And that's not a bad translation, but we need to understand there's a lot of subtext there. So the Hebrew word that's used there for spirit is the Hebrew word ruach, and most literally it's translated as wind. So God's wind hovered over the waters or fluttered over the waters. And God's wind is oftentimes associated with his power. It conjures up the image or a word picture of a bull snorting from its nostrils. And if you can envision that in your mind, that is a very powerful picture. If you've ever been around cattle or bulls in particular, we're not talking about just like a little kind of a thing. Like it is a violent kind of snort at times. And so you can get the connotation here. Places where this word shows up, Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, After Noah's flood and the floodwaters are about to recede, God sends his ruach, his wind, to dry up this huge flood that covered the world and destroyed it. And so it's God's breath, his wind, that just whoosh, whisks it away. You can see the powerful imagery there. A little later, and probably in keeping with the Noah story, Exodus chapter 14, verse 21, is the scene where the Israelites come to the Red Sea with the Egyptian army on one side and the sea on the other. And we read that God parts the sea with a strong east wind, a ruach. So his power blows in and blows the sea apart for the Israelites to walk across. Again, this word ruach, it's wind. You can probably see then how sometimes it refers to breath as well. And it's best translated as breath in passages like Genesis chapter 6, verse 17, Genesis chapter 7, verse 15, both in the Noah story and narrative. And at least in chapter 6, verse 17, God says that he's going to send this waters to destroy all life, everything that has the breath of life in it, the ruach of life. And here there's an interesting thing. You can kind of see it is God's, literal breath, because we breathe, but it is God's breath, his power that animates and gives life. And so we're starting to get some more nuance to this word. God's ruach, his wind, is a very powerful thing. When we get into the years 300 to 200 BC, the world changes a great deal as far as power structures. And so Alexander the Great steps onto the scene. And he was, aside from being a great conqueror of the ancient world, was a huge fan of Greek culture. And part of Greek culture had this fascination with knowledge. And so in that age, the Hebrew scriptures are translated into Greek. And that we call that collection of translations the Septuagint. And the Septuagint makes it sound like there's just one translation. There's a couple different traditions, but that body of translation we call the Septuagint. And the Greek word that is most commonly used to translate ruach is the Greek word pneuma. It's where we get our English word for pneumonia. It's a word that means breath. It's also the word that can mean spirit. And so we get passages like John chapter 20, verse 22, where Jesus has his disciples and he breathes on them literally, and he says, receive the Holy Spirit. And so there's a little bit of wordplay there. But the reason this is important is because we're starting to see linguistically and conceptually that there are connections between the ruach, the power, the wind, the breath, and the spirit. They all kind of belong linguistically and conceptually together in this, I don't even know how to describe it, in this one little package, I guess. And so it's not inappropriate to say that God's spirit hovered above the water, that the Holy Spirit, the animating power of God, that his means of interacting with his power in creation, the Holy Spirit is there at the beginning of creation, but that's not how ancient Hebrew people would have heard it. They didn't have a Trinitarian framework through which to understand and interpret God or the scriptures. So when they heard the Ruach was over the waters, especially if we're talking about Moses' audience, they're thinking about how God parted the sea, about how God drove the floodwaters away, that kind of thing, just for clarity's sake. Now, it's interesting, too. What we read is that the Ruach, God's Spirit, his wind, hovered over the deep. Word can mean hovered, also can mean flutter. And oftentimes it conjures up imagery of birds kind of flapping their wings. And we can see this in another passage, an important passage, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 10 through 12. If you give me just a second to switch over to a different slide. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 10, it says, in a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. And here's the part that's important for us right here. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers, same word as in Genesis, over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. And so we have here that word used in connection with an eagle that sort of spreads its wings or flutters its wings over its nest in protection of its young. Now, this passage, interestingly enough, is from the Song of Moses. He's celebrating the Lord. And there's a lot of language and imagery in Deuteronomy here that reminds us of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. For instance, as Deuteronomy 32 began, or as verse 10 began, in a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste, kind of draws up that image of formless and empty, chaos, barren kind of thing. And over in this formless, barren, empty, deserted place, God, who is depicted as an eagle whose wings hover over it, is there to protect his people. And what's interesting is that Deuteronomy 32 ends with, the Lord alone led him. No foreign God was with him. And that, too, just kind of draws back to Genesis. When we have this picture of the deep and God's Spirit hovering over this formless void land, there is no other God. There is no God in the deep. There is no God in the sky and the stars. There is just him. And this, again, just sort of re-emphasizes and reinforces this anti-idolatry imagery, especially if we consider that Moses is the one who composed Genesis chapter 1 as we read it, or at least shared that story with the Israelites as part of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that they all work together. And what we find is that a lot of the imagery and a lot of the vocabulary established in this creation story is picked up and adapted and referenced and alluded to, not just throughout the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but really throughout a great deal of the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. You can see, well, a good example of this is at Jesus' baptism. Jesus goes down into the Jordan River. John the Baptist raises him up. And then we read that the Holy Spirit descended upon Jesus in the form of a dove. And it is this image of God's Spirit, if we're going to borrow the Old Testament word, his ruach fluttering over the Son of God as he begins sort of a new creation. And so there's imagery and there's themes and there's elements of the Old Testament that develop here in the very beginning, that when we understand them and we grab a hold of them, it makes later books, and especially the New Testament, even richer. We can see, man, this really is just one story that's being beautifully developed and told over thousands of years. So here's some conclusions for this episode that we can walk away with just from looking at the first couple of verses. What we learn is that creation is not hostile. Whereas the deep was sort of a villain to the divinity in the ancient stories, Genesis depicts it as just there. It is just a thing waiting for God to transform it. Creation is not chaotic. Whereas, again, the deep was the home to Tiamat and the forces of chaos. That's not the picture that we get in Genesis. It is formless and empty, but it is not nothing, and it is not rebelling. It is just waiting for God to wrap his hands around it, form it, and fill it. And most importantly, creation is not divine. There's nothing about the deep. There's nothing about the emptiness or the formlessness of creation that has any divine connotations to it. It is just an inert nothing waiting for the only true divinity to work powerfully within it. That's a very different picture than what we get in other ancient Near Eastern creation stories. We notice some literary things that are important to take note of. Mainly, there's a very intentional structure to this story. And we're going to see that within the structure and the details of how it unfolds, there's even more of an anti-idolatry message, but also more emphasis on the true characters of who God is and his intentions for his world and humanity. So it's a very intentional structure. And as we mentioned earlier, we can see already just in these first 2 verses, while this is a myth, its purpose is not simply to explain to ancient people hows and whys of everything. It is a myth that demythologizes. It is a story that in many ways rescues humanity from the tyranny of capricious and inept gods. It rescues and liberates people from the whims of gods who were flippant and couldn't care less about them. And it allows us to look at creation not as this terrifying thing that is the manifestation of gods that we have to appease. It liberates us to view this as a platform that a God has given us and given us for good purpose to enjoy so that we can understand it and glorify him through it. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, the way that this story unfolds. And we really appreciate that even more when we can compare it to other ancient works and see it in its original context. So that is all that we have for today. Once again, I hope you enjoy this. We'll try to keep these sessions between 20 and 30 minutes the best that we can. We're going to dive into the formation days next week, looking at the first 3 days of creation. And so I hope that if you're enjoying this, you can tune in and give us some feedback on things we could do different or do better. Until then, we'll see you guys next time. Bye.